You're listening to Detective Tapes. Hope you enjoy the story. The late summer sun hung low over the rolling hills of Provence, France, casting long shadows across the olive groves that stretched toward the horizon. In the quaint village of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, nestled between the Alpes mountains and fields of lavender, life moved at a leisurely pace. But on the afternoon of September 13th, 2012, a chill descended that had nothing to do with the autumn breeze. Elias Moreau, a weathered man in his early 60s, pushed open the creaking wooden door of his stone cottage on the outskirts of the village. His hands, calloused from years tending the family's olive orchard, carried the faint scent of earth and leaves. He'd spent the morning pruning trees with his wife, Camille Laurent, as they always did this time of year. Their routine was as steady as the Mistral wind, until today. Camille back yet? Elias called to his son, Julien, who was sprawled on the couch, scrolling through his phone. Julien, barely 20, shook his head without looking up. "Thought you two were together all morning," he said, his voice tinged with the boredom of youth. Elias frowned, wiping sweat from his brow. "We split up after lunch. She said she'd head back early. Had to check on something near the road." Julien shrugged, unconcerned. "She's probably just at the market or something." But Elias wasn't so sure. He and Camille had been married for over 30 years, their lives intertwined like the roots of the ancient olive trees they tended. She wasn't one to wander off without a word. They'd parted ways around 11 a.m., after hearing the distant rumble of a car engine approaching their orchard. Camille had thought it might be the local agricultural inspector, checking on storm damage from the brutal tempête that had swept through Provence 2 weeks earlier, toppling trees and cutting power across the region. She'd grabbed her Vespa and sped toward the main road to investigate, leaving Elias to finish trimming. Now, it was nearly 2 p.m., and she hadn't returned. Elias tried her phone, but it rang from the bedroom. Camille's old Nokia, left charging on the nightstand. A knot tightened in his gut. She didn't take it, he muttered, more to himself than to Julien. Julien sat up, sensing his father's unease. "You okay, Dad?" Elias didn't answer. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. "Stay here. I'm going to look for her." The orchard was a 10-minute walk from the cottage, down a winding dirt path that snaked through the hills. The air was heavy with the scent of olives and dust, the silence broken only by the hum of cicadas. Elias retraced the route to where he'd last seen Camille, his boots crunching against the gravel. Julien followed, reluctant but worried enough to tag along. They reached the edge of the orchard, where the path met the narrow road leading to Saint-Rémy. There, half-tipped into a ditch, was Camille's Vespa. The keys dangled in the ignition, glinting in the sunlight. A yellow helmet, hers, lay discarded in the grass a few meters away. Elias's heart lurched. "Camille!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the hills. No response. Julien's eyes widened. "What the hell?" Elias scanned the surroundings. Tire tracks marred the dirt road, wide, deep ones, likely from a van or SUV. The area was quiet, too remote for casual passers-by, though local farmers and produce buyers sometimes drove through to negotiate deals. Nothing about the scene felt right. The Vespa wasn't damaged beyond a few scratches, and there was no blood, no sign of a crash. But Camille was gone. "Call the police," Elias said, his voice steady but strained. "Now." Julien fumbled with his phone, dialing the local gendarmerie. Elias didn't wait. He rallied a handful of neighbors, old farmers and vineyard workers who knew the land like their own skin. They fanned out, combing the olive groves and nearby trails, calling Camille's name. The hills swallowed their voices. By 3:30 p.m., 2 officers from the Saint-Rémy gendarmerie arrived, their patrol car kicking up dust as it pulled up to the abandoned Vespa. Inspector Margot Vasseur, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with a reputation for cracking cold cases, took charge. Her partner, Officer Léon Dubois, photographed the scene. The Vespa, the helmet, the tire tracks. "Any enemies?" Margot asked Elias, her pen poised over a notebook. "Anyone who might have had a grudge against your wife?" Elias shook his head, his face pale. "None. We've lived here 30 years. Never had trouble with anyone." Margot's gaze lingered on him, searching for cracks in his composure. She'd seen enough cases to know that the closest people were often the first suspects. "Tell me exactly what happened this morning." Elias recounted the morning's events, the pruning, The sound of the car, Camille's rushed to check if it was the agricultural inspector. She thought it might be about the storm damage, he said. The tempest hit us hard. Power's still spotty, and the orchard took a beating. She was worried about the irrigation system. Margot nodded, jotting notes. The tire tracks suggested a vehicle had been here recently, but in a region where produce trucks were common, that alone wasn't much to go on. The Vespa's condition ruled out a severe accident, and there were no signs of a struggle beyond the helmet in the grass. Still, something felt off. Camille Laurent, a woman in her late 50s, didn't just vanish into the Provençal hills. As the search continued, Margot's team expanded their sweep, checking the rugged terrain for clues. The Alpes hills were treacherous in places, with steep drops and hidden ravines, but the recent storm hadn't triggered any landslides. Wild animals, boars, maybe foxes, roamed the area, but nothing large enough to pose a threat. Kidnapping seemed unlikely. The Moreaus weren't wealthy, and no ransom calls had come through. By dusk, the search yielded nothing. No footprints, no torn clothing, no trace of Camille. Margot stood by the Vespa, her mind racing. The facts didn't add up. A woman doesn't abandon her scooter and helmet in the middle of nowhere. And those tire tracks, too fresh, too deliberate, nagged at her. Back at the cottage, Elias sat at the kitchen table, staring at a cold cup of coffee. Julian paced, his phone clutched tightly. "She's out there, Dad. She has to be." Elias didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the window, where the fading light painted the hills in shades of purple and gold. But all he could see was Camille's face, smiling as she rode off that morning. Margot, standing outside, lit a cigarette and exhaled into the cooling air. She'd worked missing persons cases before, but this one felt different. The quiet of Saint Remy hid something darker, she was sure of it. And as the stars began to pierce the sky, she made a silent vow. She'd find Camille Laurent, alive or dead. The morning of September 15th, 2012, dawned gray and heavy over Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. A mist clung to the Alpes hills, shrouding the olive groves in an eerie silence. Inspector Margot Vasseur stood at the edge of the Moreau orchard, her boots sinking into the damp earth. 2 days had passed since Camille Laurent vanished, and the search had turned up nothing but questions. The abandoned Vespa, the tire tracks, the yellow helmet. They were pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit. Margot's team had scoured every trail and ravine within a kilometer of the orchard. They'd interviewed neighbors, checked local hospitals, and even dragged Elias Moreau in for a second round of questioning. The man's story held. He and Camille had been pruning trees, heard a car, and split up. He claimed he'd taken a longer route home, missing the Vespa on the main road. Plausible, but Margot's gut told her there was more to it. Elias's grief seemed genuine, but grief could hide guilt. She flicked ash from her cigarette and glanced at Officer Léon Dubois, who was coordinating with a group of volunteers. "Anything from the locals?" she asked. Léon shook his head. "Same story. The Moreaus are well-liked, no enemies. A few mentioned Camille's mother, Odette, though. She's in her 80s, frail. Says she had a dream last night. Saw Camille, soaking wet, whispering, 'I'm cold.'" Margot raised an eyebrow. "A dream? That's what we're working with now." "Superstition runs deep out here," Léon said with a shrug. "They think she might have fallen into a stream or something." "There's no stream near the Vespa," Margot muttered, but she filed the detail away. She didn't believe in omens, but desperate families clung to anything. She'd humor them. Check the waterways, if only to rule it out. Her radio crackled. "Inspector, you need to get to the Valet farm. Now." The voice belonged to Sergeant Claire Renard, stationed a half-mile away. They found something. Margot's pulse quickened. She stubbed out her cigarette and gestured for Léon to follow. The Valet farm, a small plot with a fish pond and vineyard, sat just outside the village. As their patrol car sped down the narrow road, Margot's mind raced. A body? A clue? Or another dead end? They arrived to a grim scene. A farmer, Pierre Valet, stood by his pond, his face pale as chalk. A crowd of villagers had gathered, their murmurs hushed. Elias and Julien Moreau were there, too, drawn by the commotion. The air reeked of decay, a sickly sweet stench that made Margot's stomach turn. "There," Pierre pointed, his voice trembling. In the water. Margot stepped closer, peering into the murky pond. Two shapes floated just beneath the surface, bloated and grotesque. A woman's body, clad in a familiar green jacket, bobbed alongside a man's, his white shirt stained with algae. The crowd gasped as Elias staggered forward, his knees buckling. "Camille!" He choked, tears streaming down his face. "That's her." Margot held up a hand, keeping the villagers back. "Stay clear," she barked. Her team moved in, wading into the shallow pond to retrieve the bodies. As they dragged Camille's corpse onto the bank, Julian turned away, retching. Elias sank to the ground, sobbing. The second body, a man, mid-40s, tall and broad-shouldered, was a stranger. No shoes, no wallet, no identification. His dark trousers and white shirt were soaked through, his face swollen but intact. Margot crouched beside him, noting the bruising around his neck. Rope marks, she thought. Not hands. "Who is he?" Lyon asked, scanning the crowd. No one answered. The villagers stared, some whispering, others crossing themselves. Margot called for the coroner, Dr. Sabine Thiers, one of the best forensic pathologists in Marseille. While her team secured the scene, Margot studied the bodies. Camille's neck bore marks too, fainter, broader, like someone had grabbed her throat. Both victims had scratches on their arms, signs of a struggle. But the pond was a good 10-minute walk from the Vespa. How had they ended up here? Dr. Thiers arrived within the hour, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. "I'll need them in the lab," she said, her voice clipped. "But I can tell you now, those marks suggest they were strangled, or at least restrained. Death was likely recent, within 48 hours. Margot nodded, her mind already spinning. 2 bodies, same pond, same time of death. Were they connected? Camille was a local, a farmer's wife. The man was an outsider, unknown. A lover? A business partner? Or something else entirely? Back at the gendarmerie, Margot pored over the initial findings. Elias's alibi was shaky but unprovable. Only he and Camille had been at the orchard that morning. She dug into his background. No criminal record, no debts beyond a modest mortgage, no whispers of affairs or feuds. Yet the tire tracks by the Vespa suggested a vehicle, and Elias drove only an old Peugeot, its tires too narrow to match. As night fell, a call came from Dr. Thiers. "Preliminary autopsy results," she said. "Both victims died between 10:30 and 11 a.m. on the 13th. Cause of death, drowning. Camille had water in her lungs and fluid in her sphenoid sinus, consistent with being alive when she hit the water. Same for the man. The neck marks weren't fatal. They were restrained, not killed outright." Margot's jaw tightened. "So they were dumped alive?" "Looks that way," Thiers said. "And there's something else. The scratches on their arms, defensive wounds. They fought back. Whoever did this had to overpower 2 people, likely at the same time." Margot hung up, her mind racing. 2 victims, attacked together, thrown into a pond to drown. The man's identity was key. She ordered a fingerprint check and a public appeal for information, broadcasting his description, white shirt, dark trousers, no shoes, across local news channels. As she left the station, a thought nagged at her. Elias had mentioned the car engine Camille heard. Could it be the same vehicle that left those tire tracks? And if so, who was driving it? In the darkness of Saint Remy, the hills seemed to whisper secrets. Margot lit another cigarette, the ember glowing like a warning. The truth was out there, hidden in the shadows of the orchard. She just had to find it. The Saint Remy gendarmerie buzzed with quiet intensity on the morning of September 17, 2012. Inspector Margot Vasseur sat at her desk, surrounded by maps of the Alpilles and grainy photos of tire tracks. The autopsy reports from Dr. Sabine Thiers lay open before her, their stark details painting a grim picture. Camille Laurent and the unidentified man had drowned, alive but unconscious when they hit the pond. The scratches on their arms spoke of a struggle, the marks on their necks of restraint. Someone had overpowered them, dragged them to the water, and left them to die. Margot sipped her espresso, the bitterness grounding her. 2 victims, one local, one a stranger. The key to unraveling this lay in identifying the man. His fingerprints had turned up nothing in the national database. No criminal record, no prior arrests. She'd ordered a public appeal, broadcasting his description across province's news channels. Male, mid-40s, 1.72 meters, 74 kilograms, white shirt over a black tee, dark trousers, no shoes. The lack of shoes gnawed at her. Where were they? Lost in a struggle? Hidden by the killer? Her phone rang, shattering her thoughts. It was Leon Dubois, stationed at the evidence room. "We got a hit," he said, his voice tight with excitement. "A woman from Aix-en-Provence saw the news. Says the man looks like her husband." Margot was already grabbing her coat. "Name? Victor Renault, 45. Businessman. She's coming to the station now." 30 minutes later, Margot stood in the morgue, watching Claire Renault, a petite woman with red-rimmed eyes, stare at the body on the slab. Claire's hands trembled as she nodded. "That's him. That's Victor." Her voice broke, and she clutched a tissue, tears spilling over. "He left home on the 12th, said he was meeting clients. He didn't come back." Margot exchanged a glance with Dr. Thiers, who stood quietly by the door. "Did he say where he was going?" Margot asked. "Saint Remy," Claire whispered. "Something about a land deal. He was a broker, specialized in agricultural properties, vineyards, orchards. He'd been working with some new clients, but he didn't tell me much. Victor was private about his work." Margot jotted notes, her mind racing. "A broker in Saint Remy, near the Moreau orchard, on the day Camille vanished. Too neat to be coincidence." "Did he mention any names? Clients, partners?" Claire shook her head. "He just said it was a big deal. Left on his motorcycle around 6 a.m. on the 13th. I tried calling him that night, but his phone was off. I thought he was just busy, but then," she trailed off, sobbing. Margot guided her to a chair, her tone softening. "We'll need a DNA sample to confirm, but this helps." "Thank you, Madame Renault." Back in her office, Margot pulled Victor's phone records, obtained through a rush order from the telecom company. The data traced his movements, leaving Aix-en-Provence at dawn, arriving in Saint Remy by 9 a.m., lingering near a vineyard on the village's outskirts for an hour, then moving toward the Moreau orchard by 10:30 a.m. At 10:36, his signal vanished. Margot cross-referenced the location. It matched the area where Camille's Vespa was found. "Lyon," she called, striding into the evidence room. "Get me everything on Victor Renault. Business dealings, clients, debts, and find his motorcycle." By midday, they had a lead. Victor's motorcycle, a black Triumph, was found at a small parking lot halfway between Aix and Saint Remy, registered under his name. The lot's attendant, a grizzled man named Gillis, scratched his beard when questioned. "Yeah, I remember him. Dropped the bike off around 8:30 a.m. on the 13th. Got into a silver van with a couple of guys. Didn't see the plates, but the van looked beat up, like it had seen better days." Margot's pulse quickened. A silver van. The tire tracks near the Vespa could belong to one. "Did you see who was driving?" Gillis shrugged. "Didn't get a good look. 3 men, maybe 4. One was younger, stocky. Another was older, bald on top. That's all I got." It was enough to start with. Margot ordered a sweep of traffic cameras along the route from Aix to Saint Remy, focusing on silver vans. It was a needle in a haystack. Hundreds of vehicles passed through daily, but the phone data gave them a timeline to narrow the search. She also dug into Victor's life. He was a middleman, brokering deals for vineyards and farmland across Provence. His finances were solid, no major debts, but his recent calls showed frequent contact with a number registered to a man named Hugo Voss, 26, a low-level thug with a rap sheet for assault and public disturbance. Margot leaned back, piecing it together. Victor, a broker, meeting clients in Saint Remy. A silver van. Camille, hearing a vehicle and riding out to check. 2 bodies in a pond, both drowned. The connection was there, just out of reach. She drove to the Moreau cottage that afternoon, finding Elias in the garden, staring blankly at his olive trees. Julien hovered nearby, his face drawn. "Any news?" Elias asked, his voice hollow. "We're making progress," Margot said carefully. "We identified the man. Victor Renault, a broker from Aix. Did Camille ever mention him?" Elias frowned, shaking his head. "Never heard of him. Camille didn't deal with brokers. We own the orchard outright. No plans to sell." Margot studied him. His denial seemed genuine, but she couldn't shake the feeling he was holding something back. "You mentioned hearing a car that morning. Could it have been a van? Silver, maybe?" Elias hesitated, his eyes flickering. "Maybe. It was far off. I didn't see it." She nodded, filing away his pause. Back at the station, the camera footage was trickling in. After hours of sifting through grainy images, Lyon called her over. "Got something. Silver van. caught on a camera near the orchard at 10:20 a.m. on the 13th. 3 men inside, 1 driving. Plates are partial, but it's registered to Hugo Voss. Margot's heart raced. Hugo Voss again. She pulled his file, a history of bar fights, a stint in prison, and ties to a small-time crew in Marseille. He wasn't alone. His known associates included Roland Becker, 38, a convicted drug dealer, and Simon Lefebvre, 33, a former cellmate with a record for illegal weapons. All 3 had been spotted in Saint-Remy the week of the murders. "Bring them in," Margot ordered. "All 3. And find that van." As night fell, the pieces were aligning. Victor Renault, a broker, had crossed paths with a dangerous crew. Camille Laurent, in the wrong place at the wrong time, had paid the ultimate price. But why? A deal gone wrong? A witness silenced? Margot lit a cigarette, staring out at the darkened hills. The truth was closer, but the shadows were still deep. The interrogation room at the Saint-Remy Gendarmerie was a stark cube of concrete and fluorescent light, its air thick with tension. Inspector Margot Vasseur leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching Hugo Voss slouch in his chair. The 26-year-old thug's shaved head gleamed under the glare, his eyes darting like a cornered animal's. Across the hall, Roland Becker and Simon Lefebvre waited in separate rooms, isolated to prevent collusion. It was September 18, 2012, and Margot was closing in. Hugo's rap sheet painted him as a small-time enforcer, bar brawls, extortion, a year in prison for assault. His associates, Roland and Simon, were worse. Roland had served 10 years for drug trafficking and illegal firearms, while Simon was a repeat offender with a knack for violence. Their phone records tied them to Victor Renault, the broker found dead alongside Camille Laurent in the Valais Farms pond. More damning, their silver van matched the tire tracks near Camille's Vespa, and its route aligned with Victor's phone signal on the morning of the murders. Margot slid a photo of the van across the table. "This is yours, Hugo." Caught on camera near the Moreau Orchard, 10:20 a.m., September 13th. Care to explain? Hugo's jaw twitched, but he kept his gaze on the table. "Don't know what you're talking about. I was in Marseille that day." "Lying's a bad start," Margot said, her voice cold. "Your phone pinged a tower in Saint-Remy at 9 a.m. So did Roland's and Simon's. You were all there, with Victor Renault. Want to try again?" Hugo's fingers drummed the table, a nervous tick. "I don't know any Victor." Margot leaned in, her eyes boring into his. "He was a broker. You called him 6 times in the week before he died. He was in your van, Hugo. Then he ended up in a pond with a local woman, both drowned. You're looking at murder charges unless you start talking." Hugo's bravado cracked, his shoulders hunching. "I didn't kill anyone," he muttered. "It wasn't supposed to go down like that." Margot's pulse quickened, but she kept her face neutral. "What wasn't supposed to happen? Tell me, Hugo." "Now." Across the hall, Officer Léon Dubois grilled Roland Becker, the group's ringleader. At 38, Roland was a hulking figure with a bald crown and a scar slicing through his left eyebrow. His prison time had hardened him, but Léon sensed a calculating mind behind the thug's facade. Roland's story mirrored Hugo's. He was in Marseille, hadn't seen Victor, didn't know Camille. But his calm demeanor frayed when Léon mentioned the van's GPS data, which placed it near the orchard. "You're lying, Roland," Léon said, tossing Victor's phone records onto the table. "You met Victor at a vineyard that morning. He was brokering a deal for you, wasn't he? What went wrong?" Roland's eyes narrowed, but he stayed silent. Léon pressed harder, detailing the autopsy findings: drowning, defensive wounds, the rope marks on Victor's neck. "Camille Laurent saw something she shouldn't have, didn't she? You had to silence her." Roland's fist clenched, but he held his tongue. Léon knew he'd need more to break him. Simon Lefebvre, the youngest at 33, was the weak link. His lanky frame fidgeted in the chair, his eyes bloodshot from a night in custody. Margot joined Léon in Simon's room, sensing an opportunity. "Simon," she said, her tone almost gentle, "Hugo's talking. He says you and Roland were in on it. You don't want to be the last one holding the bag." Simon's head snapped up, panic flashing across his face. "That's bullshit. I didn't do nothing." "Then tell us what happened," Margot urged. "Victor Renault, Camille Laurent. Why are they dead?" Simon's resolve crumbled. Words spilled out, halting and frantic. "It was Roland's idea, okay? The vineyard deal. Victor was supposed to broker it, get us a buyer. We thought it was worth millions. Margot exchanged a glance with Lyon. What kind of deal? Simon swallowed hard. Roland bought a vineyard plot, 10 hectares, from a guy Hugo knew. Paid 2 million euros, borrowed from some bad people in Marseille. Victor said he could flip it for 6 million, prime land, old vines, perfect for a luxury winery. We trusted him. Margot's mind raced, connecting the dots. Victor Renault, a broker, had promised a windfall. The vineyard explained his presence in Saint Remy. So what went wrong? She asked. Simon's voice dropped. We took Victor to see the land that morning. Hugo drove, Roland and me in the back. Victor checked the soil, the vines, everything. Then he said it was junk, barely worth $1 million. The vines were diseased, the soil depleted. No buyer would touch it. Roland lost it. Margot leaned forward. Lost it how? Simon hesitated, his eyes darting to the door. He started yelling. Said Victor was scamming us, cutting a side deal with the seller. Victor swore he wasn't, but Roland wouldn't listen. On the way back, things got bad. Bad how? Lyon pressed. Simon's voice was barely a whisper. Roland grabbed a rope from the van, one we used for hauling gear. He looped it around Victor's neck, right there in the front seat. Hugo was driving, freaking out. I told Roland to stop, but he was like a man possessed. Victor went limp, and we thought he was dead. Margot's stomach churned, but she kept her composure. And Camille Laurent? Simon's eyes welled up. We didn't know her. After Victor, we pulled over near some orchard to figure out what to do. Roland wanted to dump the body in a ditch. Then this woman, Camille, came up on a scooter. She saw us dragging Victor out. Roland panicked, said she'd talk. He grabbed her, choked her with his hands till she stopped moving. We didn't mean for it to happen. Margot's jaw tightened. Camille, a bystander, caught in the wrong moment. Then what? We drove to a pond we'd seen earlier, off a back road. Roland said it was deep enough to hide them. We carried them down the slope. Roland and Hugo took Victor. I took Camille. I slipped, and she rolled down, got scratched up. We threw them in, thought they were gone. But Simon's voice broke. They weren't dead, were they? Margot didn't answer. The autopsies confirmed it. Victor and Camille were unconscious, but alive when they hit the water. Drowning killed them. She stood, signaling Lyon to wrap up. Get his statement in writing, she said, stepping out. In the hallway, she lit a cigarette, her mind racing. Simon's confession gave them the sequence. A failed deal, Roland's rage, Victor's strangulation, Camille's chance encounter. But Roland was the key. He'd orchestrated it, and Hugo and Simon had followed, too scared or loyal to stop him. She re-entered Roland's room, slamming the door. Simon talked. Roland, you're done. Victor Renault, Camille Laurent, you killed them over a bad deal. Confess, or we bury you. Roland's eyes burned with defiance, but a flicker of fear betrayed him. You've got nothing, he growled. Simon's a liar. We've got your van, your phone records, Simon's statement, and Hugo's about to crack. Margot shot back. We found Victor's shoes, Roland. In your van, under the seat. Explain that. It was a bluff. The shoes hadn't been found yet, but Roland's face paled. He knew the van hadn't been cleaned. You're fishing, he said, but his voice wavered. Margot leaned in, her voice low and lethal. You're going down for 2 murders. Help yourself. Tell me why. Roland's silence stretched, then broke. Victor screwed us, he spat. Said that vineyard was gold. Got me to borrow millions. Then he pulls the rug out, says it's worthless. I wasn't going back to those loan sharks empty-handed. He had it coming. And Camille? Margot pressed. Roland's eyes darkened. Wrong place, wrong time. She saw us. I had no choice. Margot stepped back, her heart pounding. Roland's confession sealed it. The case was breaking open, but one question lingered. Would the court see Simon and Hugo as accomplices or killers? The courtroom in Aix-en-Provence was a study in contrasts. Polished wood benches gleaming under chandeliers, yet heavy with the weight of grief and justice. It was March 15, 2013, 6 months after Camille Laurent and Victor Renault were pulled from the murky pond in Saint Remy. Inspector Margot Vasseur sat in the back row, her arms crossed, watching the trial unfold. The air was thick with anticipation, the gallery packed with villagers, reporters, and the families of the victims. Roland Becker, Hugo Voss, and Simon Lefebvre sat at the defense table, their faces a mix of defiance and dread. Roland, The ringleader stared straight ahead, his scarred eyebrow twitching. Hugo's nervous energy had dulled to resignation, while Simon's eyes darted to the crowd, as if searching for salvation. Their confessions, extracted after hours of interrogation, had cracked the case wide open, but the courtroom was where their fates would be sealed. The prosecutor, Claire Dubois, a sharp-tongued woman with a reputation for dismantling defenses, laid out the case with surgical precision. She recounted the morning of September 13, 2012. Victor Renault, a broker from Aix, lured to Saint Remy under the pretense of a lucrative vineyard deal. Camille Laurent, a farmer's wife, caught in a fatal moment of chance, and the silver van, driven by Hugo, carrying Roland's rage and Simon's complicity. The evidence was damning. Phone records tracing their movements, traffic camera footage of the van, and Simon's detailed confession, corroborated by Hugo's reluctant admissions. The defendants acted with intent, Claire declared, her voice cutting through the room. Roland Becker strangled Victor Renault with a rope, believing he'd been cheated in a deal. When Camille Laurent stumbled upon their crime, Becker choked her unconscious. All three, Becker, Voss, and Lefebvre, carried the victims to a pond and threw them in, alive, to drown. This was no accident. This was murder. Margot's mind flashed to the autopsy reports. Dr. Sabine Thiers had been unequivocal. Camille and Victor had water in their lungs, fluid in their sphenoid sinuses. They were breathing when they hit the water. The scratches on their arms, the marks on their necks, told a story of desperation. Margot glanced at Elias Moreau, seated near the front, his face etched with pain. Beside him, Julien gripped his father's hand, his eyes red but dry. Claire Renault, Victor's widow, sat alone, clutching a photo of her husband. The defense attorneys, a trio of overworked public defenders, fought an uphill battle. Roland's lawyer argued he'd acted in a fit of rage, not premeditation, claiming the vineyard deal's collapse had pushed him to a breaking point. My client believed Victor Renault conspired to defraud him, the lawyer said. He lashed out impulsively. Camille Laurent's death was a tragic accident, not a planned act. Hugo and Simon's attorneys leaned harder, painting their clients as unwilling accomplices, terrified of Roland's wrath. Hugo Voss and Simon Lefebvre were coerced, Simon's lawyer insisted. They feared for their lives. They believed the victims were already dead when they disposed of the bodies. This is, at worst, manslaughter, not murder. Claire Dubois dismantled their arguments with ferocity. Coerced, she scoffed, holding up a photo of the pond. They drove to a secluded spot, carried two unconscious victims down a slope, and threw them into water. They saw the bodies sink. They heard no screams because they didn't wait. If they believed the victims were dead, why not check? Why not call for help? Their inaction was complicity. Their silence was murder. Margot admired Claire's precision, but felt a twinge of unease. Hugo and Simon's fear of Roland was palpable during their interrogations. Roland had a history of violence, a temper that cowed his crew. Yet the evidence was clear. They'd helped move the bodies, knowing the pond would hide their crime. The scratches on Camille's arms, likely from her fall down the slope as Simon stumbled, suggested she'd stirred, perhaps fought back. They'd had a chance to stop, to save her, and they didn't. The trial stretched over days, each side sparring over intent, coercion, and culpability. The defense called character witnesses, friends who claimed Hugo and Simon were good kids, led astray by Roland's influence. The prosecution countered with Roland's prison record and the trio's history of running protection rackets in Marseille's bars, painting them as predators who saw Victor and Camille as obstacles to be erased. On the final day, the judge, a stern woman named Isabelle Fournier, delivered the verdict. The courtroom fell silent as she spoke. Roland Becker, as the instigator and primary actor in the murders of Victor Renault and Camille Laurent, you were found guilty of 2 counts of premeditated murder. Your actions were calculated, driven by greed and a desire to cover your tracks. The court sentences you to life imprisonment without parole. Roland's face remained stone, but his hands clenched the table's edge. Hugo Voss and Simon Lefebvre, Judge Fournier continued, you were found guilty of 2 counts of murder. While you acted under Becker's influence, your participation in the disposal of living victims constitutes intentional homicide. You had opportunities to intervene and chose not to. The court sentences you each to 25 years, with the possibility of parole after 15. Hugo's head dropped, Simon's shoulders shook, but neither spoke. The gallery erupted in whispers. Elias Moreau sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the floor. Claire Renault wept silently, her photo of Victor crumpled in her hand. Margot stepped outside, lighting a cigarette as the Provençal sun dipped below the horizon. The case was closed, but the weight lingered. Camille, a woman tending her orchard, and Victor, a broker chasing a deal, had crossed paths with men who valued money over lives. Roland's greed had sparked the chain of events, but Hugo and Simon's cowardice had sealed it. Two families were shattered, and no verdict could undo that. She exhaled, watching the smoke curl into the dusk. The Alp hills loomed in the distance, their shadows stretching across the fields. Saint Remy would heal, but the scars would remain. Margot crushed her cigarette under her boot and turned away, ready for the next case, the next shadow.